Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session. And if you are new here, thank you so much for joining us today. We are super excited to be here. We usually are, actually. I think every single time we've been very excited because this is some of our favorite conversations that we get to have with our favorite clinicians that we've gotten to meet. And for those of you that have maybe never been a listener of sessions, my name is Mandi Roarke, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I practice locally in Austin for in-person sessions, but I also do telehealth sessions all over the state of Texas. And I am also one of the co-founders of Zessio, and here with my fellow co-founder.
Yes, I am Dr. Sapna Srivastava, fellow co-founder of Zessio, which is a platform that Mandy and I have created for mental health resources created by mental health therapists. And welcome to Sessions. As Mandy said, Sessions is podcast episodes that are conversations amongst clinicians. We talk about topics typically addressed in the mental health world from the perspective of therapists who are supporting and talking with clients daily.
Yes, and today our topic is long distance relationships. And this is an exciting topic to get into. I mean, I'll speak for myself, but all of us are systemic therapists, so I'm really excited to nerd out about this topic and just like all of the relational elements that fall into being in a long distance relationship. But we're so pumped to have Bri Craig here. We've worked with Bri since like, I mean, on and off, like kept in touch for like 2021. We just realized it's been like 4 years. So happy anniversary in our friendship here. But
Yeah.
we'll let Bri introduce themselves and kind of get this conversation off the tracks.
Sounds good. Yeah, the OG Zesho
Heck
crew.
yes.
That's what
Hmm.
we
That is the name.
named ourselves. Yeah, happy to be here, excited to be here. Yeah, my name is Bree. I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist practicing in Austin. In my practice, yeah, I mainly work with queer folks, couples, neurodivergence, ADHD, and autism specifically has kind of been a new niche of mine. And yeah, I myself actually have been in a long distance relationship the last 2.5 years now. So this feels like a very kind of personal topic to me as well as, helping couples that I've worked with in a similar dynamic. So yeah, happy to share little tidbits about things that maybe I relate to as we go. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah. Also feel the need to just have a little check-in. How are we all today? Where are we all today? I just
Mm.
realized for anyone who happens to watch on YouTube or our website, like my eye's been watering on and off, I feel like for the last week, and I don't know if it's allergies or what, but it's continuing to. So know that if I'm touching my eye, I'm probably not emotional. It's probably just allergies, but it's obviously okay if I'm emotional too. We'll see
Totally.
which one it is.
Yes.
That's
And
very
while we're on it, I might as well mention that I had some dental work done this morning. And so if there's any strange sounds, I'm doing my best to mute myself when I drink water, but we do our best here.
all human stuff. So,
Yes,
Yeah, it's good housekeeping.
right.
yeah, for sure.
We're just as we are.
Yeah.
Well, before we really dive in, I'll also go over a little bit of housekeeping, because I'm excited to talk about long distance relationships, especially also having been in a long distance relationship previously and realizing there's just so little information out there on how to navigate them. So, um, I will I will be excited to come back to that. But if you do enjoy our content, if you find it any kind of helpful, please do consider liking, following, and or giving a positive review on any and all of the platforms for podcasts that you prefer. The ratings and reviews help more people who could benefit from our resources find us. And additionally, you can also follow us on all the social media platforms. So Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. Our handle is at myzessio, so MyZessio. And you can also access additional mental health resources at our website, which is our platform, zessio.com, zessio.com.
And from Zesha.com, we have an option for you to watch the video too. So if you're someone who likes to very visual, we invite you to check that out. And we've have a couple of companion courses from some of our last podcasts that we've done also, or episodes. So that's something we're trying out. So check them out and let us know what you think. If you visit Zesho.com, we'd love to hear from you. So now it's time to hear from Bri, huh?
Yeah. So, Brie, we usually start with in most of our topics, kind of defining what we mean by
Mhm.
that particular topic. So in this instance, what is considered a long distance relationship? How would you describe or define them, and what can they typically look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the way that I kind of understand them, or I guess how I've kind of explained this to folks, is essentially a relationship that relies heavily on technology to stay connected. In addition to the partners in that relationship not being in the same geographical location. Um, yeah, and I would also add to like where each partner is living is far enough apart to where seeing one another on a regular basis is really challenging. So really, you might be spending more time apart than you are actually together. And yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways that this can look, but I think as I was preparing for this, was kind of considering different dynamics where long distance might be possible or might be an occurrence is couples where one spouse is in the military and is deployed, a couple where one partner might be incarcerated or potentially deported. Also just the inception of, like dating apps, being on social media, like the possibility to meet people that are not from the same place that you live is very high. And yeah, so I think even just the idea of people not living in the same space to begin with, and that's kind of where the relationship starts, which is actually the case for my partner and I. We're not from the same country, so that's like another way that this can look. So yeah, lots of different ways that these can kind of show up. But that's kind of the gist, I would say, of what we're talking about when we say a long distance relationship.
Yeah, I think it's helpful that you pointed out that it's not just like far distances because that is where my mind goes. When I think long distance, I'm like, oh, y'all must live like across country or different states or whatever. But when you were saying that, it did make me think about even couples that I support where one of them lives like on the other side of town in Austin. And I know that's like, maybe most people wouldn't say that's long distance, but I like the way that you were saying that it's like, when they are more reliant upon technology or they're not able to see each other as frequently as they like, just because it is challenging with their day-to-day schedule. So I think that helped me expand my definition on it already, for sure.
Yeah, and I've heard people say that in relation to like bigger cities as well, of like if they're not within 4 metro stops to me, or um, if they're in a different, like I'm thinking of like New York City, if they're in a different borough, like I consider that long distance. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
there's a bunch of different versions and definitions in that sense too, but I like how you kind of really broke it down into uh geographical differences and being able to see each other less, or being able to be together less than you are, far less than you are apart. That ratio is very variable, but it's always going to be lower on the together part.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I guess the other thing I would say is, I mean, you get to decide and constitute what you feel is long distance,
Yeah.
like any, depending on who you ask, they might have a different definition, right? But I think that for me, this is how I like to understand it. And also, that doesn't necessarily work for everybody. So, like, that's okay too.
Mhm.
Yeah. So,
When we start thinking about long distance relationships, like I imagine that the first thing that a lot of people would have to navigate is just like challenges, like
Yeah.
like wanting to be maybe closer
Mm.
and have more of access to one another. And so I am curious of maybe I'm just like open, we're probably opening up like the conversation with the many different wings or directions we can take this,
Sure.
but what would you say are some of the challenges that folks in long distance relationships tend to encounter?
Yeah, yeah, there are many for sure. Which is, yeah, something that maybe we can talk about later is there are a lot of challenges like that is just the nature of being in this type of dynamic, which is, I think, important to note because yeah, we also have to talk about the things that like can keep us together, and like ways that we can appreciate one another even with the challenges, right? Which is again maybe a later topic that we touch on, but yeah, I mean, I think the first one really is just literally having to rely so much on technology. And obviously there's limitations to that. We don't get like the full picture sometimes of what actually is going on for each person. We may not be getting nonverbal cues, right? We may not be getting body language, like things might get lost in translation, depending on what method we're talking about, right? I also know that just we could probably all attest to this, like we get fatigued by having to use these platforms, by having to use um, tech, like in the pandemic, that was like the only way we were able to stay connected. So sometimes you just don't have it. Sometimes it's like I would rather do anything else but sit here in front of this computer, or be on video. And so dealing with just the fatigue of knowing that this is the only way, literally, this might be the only way we can be connected, and that can suck sometimes. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think the other piece too is just like there are maybe going to be preferences and differences in the way that people feel comfortable communicating. Some people might not want to be on video as much, or some people might prefer phone calls, right? Um, and then when you're adding in layers like also potentially like neurotype differences, where that's going to like present another challenge. Um, like trying to really be understanding of one another and what those preferences and methods are going to be. And realizing too that sometimes you may not be getting your way all the time and like what feels good for you because you're having to consider the other person as well. Um, I mean, I could go on. I guess the other thing I'm considering too is just like how often are we going to speak? Um, when we're talking about things like time zone differences or opposite work hours, um, right? Like that presents its own host of challenges where we literally are just trying to vie for like when our schedules align so we can speak. Um, and yeah, it may not be realistic, right, to talk multiple times a day, depending on what your situation is. And so it's like, yeah, maybe it's a call in the morning and a text throughout the day, but like really just getting clear again on how often, because it is going to look different than if they're next to you or in the same city as you and you can get to them and access them really easily. Um, Maybe I'll pause because I feel like I could keep going before I do that. Just yeah, to I guess give some space.
Well, maybe we can combine questions because another question I had was um kind of what are some of the logistical and like relational aspects that people who are in a long distance relationship should be like extra careful, extra intentional about communicating about or establishing when making sure to maintain. Because like my experience that I feel like many people would know, but maybe people don't realize is like long distance relationships often tend to take additional effort than maybe like in-person relationships do.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's like this um assumption out there oftentimes that, oh, you don't have to do as much for that relationship if you don't see them as often. But it's kind of
Mhm.
the opposite of like not only getting creative, but having to be that much more intentional and that much more communicative.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so what are some of those uh areas, topics issues that it would be really helpful to be additionally intentional about
Mhm.
agreeing on or communicating about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, maybe to just go back, I didn't necessarily say this, but yeah, really just getting clear on like how are we going to speak, how often, and if this isn't working, how are we going to like make this change, you know? I think to your point about the extra effort that's required, right? Sometimes we don't have it. Like
Yeah.
we literally don't have access to that, right? So one of the things that I do like to talk about is it's called spoons theory, kind of comes from the chronically ill disabled community to kind of talk about how much energy is required to do XYZ task, right? And we may only have like a certain amount of spoons that we're starting out with. And then when we're adding in stress and transitions that we weren't prepared for, right? That's going to take away that total amount that we have, you know? So there might be a day where we're coming in and we just don't have a lot of spoons to even really be in that moment with our partner, you know? So I think like using that almost just as a way to gauge, um, yeah, where am I at today? Where are you at? And what is our capacity to be in connection right now? Maybe today is just a day where we are going to stay like surface level because we can't go deeper than that. You know, we can't really get into maybe some of these more meaningful conversations. Maybe we decide we're going to schedule time for that later, right? But I think using yeah, just this idea of spoons can be helpful to kind of yeah, gauge like where we're at and how much energy we really have to kind of give to the relationship like on a day-to-day basis.
I've never heard of the spoon scales. I like that. It's a good visual for me too, as I'm thinking through of like, how many spoons do I have left at the end of the day, really? And where do I use it, if you will?
Mhm.
I'm trying to think of how to say this because maybe I'm jumping way ahead, but I think what came up for me when you were talking about that was like how, and maybe this ties in with what Sapna was talking about too, around like the conversation of like, what could happen when, someone doesn't have the capacity in the relationship, like they have no spoons left, if I'm thinking about this right. And then it's like, I can imagine the person on the other side of the relationship feeling like that. I mean, yes, they're feeling the distance, but it's also like I'm just thinking about myself maybe in traveling, right? Where like there's been a prolonged period of time where I'm away from my partner and being kind of like, I mean, just maybe being a little vulnerable here, being like, man, like I haven't really heard from them today. Like I'm kind of, like, are they thinking of me? And what, like I'm thinking about, like I miss them. I'm thinking about them, but like, they're being so sparse with their communication or whatever. And like, in that case, it's like maybe it does go back to communications. Like, is that like code that could be
Mhm.
used almost? Like, I've got no spoons left, not that that has to be like the protocol for relationships, but I am thinking about like
Yeah.
some of that anxious, like, energy that can come up or like insecurity almost of like, I'm thinking
Mhm.
about this person, but I don't know if they're thinking of me. And like, when you
Yeah.
rely upon technology and it's like, I'm not getting anything, I could imagine that would be like, there's so
Yeah.
much space. Like, how do I sit in that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's probably one of the skills that is challenged or the skills that is necessary to grow in if this is the type of dynamic that you are in, right? Which is that there are just going to be these times where it's uncomfortable and maybe I can't reach my partner and that's not a indication that they don't care about me or they don't love me or this isn't important to them. It's like there could be all of these other factors, right, contributing to why it's just hard to feel like held, you know, and witnessed in these moments where yeah, you might be literally a sea apart from each other, you know? So yeah, just the growing in the capacity to tolerate some of that anxiety and some of that discomfort, I think is important. And yeah, still also having a sense of when we're out of those moments, yeah, how can we really make sure that we are showing one another that we are engaged and present as much as possible? Um, because yeah, that's definitely going to happen. There's definitely going to be moments where that anxiety and that kind of restlessness and questioning, doubting, right? All of that I think is really normal in general in most relationships, but like especially when you're dealing with this element of I physically don't have this person close to me. And that's I think a hard thing. That's a
It's
hard
like you
thing
don't see it,
to,
right?
yeah, to like orient yourself to.
Mhm.
Yeah, especially when like oftentimes you become used to like co-regulating is such a therapist way of saying it, but like basically being able to calm ourselves and each other through that connection with our partner, whether it's just
Mhm.
verbal emotional connection or even physical connection, especially physical connection for those who like really benefit from physical touch.
Mhm.
And that's often missing. And then especially when like that's the source of your anxiety or your discomfort, it
Yeah,
can be that much more of like extra layers of challenging navigating that. Um, and
yeah.
so, yeah, I want to ask a little bit more about that, but before we do, I also want to say how much I love the spoon theory in relation to that because something that I not only encountered myself in my experience in a long distance relationship, but also have talked to clients about who have navigated long distance relationships as well or were in the process of it. And um, one thing is like when there's like heavier, more serious things to talk about, whether it's just from our personal lives, but also like especially in relation to the actual relationship and the frequency of your communication is often so low to begin with, like how to not overwhelm the interactions that you have to be negative or like serious or, less playful and connective in that way sometimes. Like that
Mhm.
hesitancy to really choose your moment, right? Of when you're actually going to bring things up. And so I kind of like the spoons in relation to like, hey, I have this thing that I do want to talk to you about. Is this like a good spoon day to talk about it? Or should we just like make sure we schedule it another time when chances are higher we're gonna have
Yeah.
better, like more spoons? Um, so I really like that as well.
Yeah.
But going back to asking more about kind of dealing with sitting with that like anxiety or discomfort
Mhm.
um, in a long distance relationship, like, what are some of the things that you tend to suggest to clients dealing with kind of what are like tools or techniques that you give to clients or work with clients on in being able to sit with that anxiety or that discomfort a little bit more? Uh,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I think the one that kind of comes to mind off the top of my head, this is kind of more for each individual like partner, in the relationship. Um, yeah, just this idea of kind of befriending your own nervous system, right? So really kind of learning what your body is trying to tell you, what your body might be trying to communicate to you. So really kind of helping, yeah, like name the emotion, name the anxiety, but also get in touch with like how is my body experiencing this emotion right now? Like what are the physical sensations that kind of go along with this? And how can I tend to that, literally tend to those sensations. So this is kind of along the lines of like somatic therapy, right? So um yeah, trying to connect to our vagus nerve, trying to kind of offer ourselves like compassionate touch. Sometimes I'll tell folks about, yeah, it's called a butterfly hug. So kind of being able to kind of notice and feel the container of our body and how that emotion might be in our body at that moment, while also kind of focusing on our breath. Tapping is another really good one. That one can help too. Something else that I wanted to mention that's kind of more related to like the relationship, right? Ways that you can help with settling some of this anxiety. It's like even if we aren't physically together, I do think there is still value in being able to share when we would like to be physically close with our partner, you know? So something that like my partner and I will do is if one or both of us are struggling, we'll say like, "Oh, I really wish I could give you a hug right now," or "I'm imagining holding your hand as you're saying that," or right, like I do think our mind is powerful and like the act of visualization and imagination can be really helpful. And so doing things like that as a way to kind of offer some comfort can be useful as well. Um, yeah, yeah, maybe again, I'll pause there before I go on.
Well, even when you just said that, like I found myself being like, oh, like I could give you a
Yeah.
hug right now. And I do think that that's, all the tips that you just shared are so helpful because it's like if in a perfect world, it's like kind of both of those things would be happening at once, where you're like self-soothing
Mhm.
while you're also getting that reinforcement from your partner.
Mhm.
And I'm kind of going back a little bit, but it does make me think about just the communication with this again, like that conversation, because I think when we first started talking about this, my mind definitely went more of like the logistical route of like, how often are we going to talk? What's that going to look like? But then it's also, I think, like really important for each individual to assess like what their individual experience is over time to then be able to like have some of those like just quick little check-ins to say like, I really appreciated when you said like I wish I could give you a hug right now. Like I noticed
Mhm.
myself just kind of like naturally calm or like feel like you were really there with me. But even
Mhm.
as I say all of that, it makes me think about like this is like such a important component of relationships just in general, right? Of like that acknowledgement and that affirmation of like, wow, when you did this, like this is the experience, like this is my experience and how powerful that was. But I'm just thinking in this case, what those tips you're sharing are like, I don't know if I'm even asking a question other than just to acknowledge that it's like, I think
Mhm.
great to call out with each other and maybe like, have you had any conversations with clients or even yourself where you've been like, what's like maybe what I'm getting to is like what's the process around that? Or is it like kind of weekly check-ins? Maybe my mind's going too structured, but you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I have like so many thoughts I could share. Maybe I'll share this and then come back because it's more in line with how to be with each other when maybe there is anxiety or sadness or I'm missing you a lot and this is just overwhelming for me, right? Like how to be with each other in these moments. It's this little tool. I didn't really develop it, but I use the acronym NERVE to
Mm.
describe like how we can kind of be with our partners, you know, when um either they're yeah, having a moment of vulnerability or like let's say we're trying to diffuse conflict. Um it's not necessarily about resolving because sometimes we just can't resolve these things. Like we can't just fix the fact that we're in a long distance relationship. So sometimes it's really just about like, yeah, how can I be witnessing my partner in their experience, in their struggle, and also again, like kind of stretching my own capacity to kind of be with what might be uncomfortable for me as I'm doing that. So NERVE stands for normalize, engage, reflect, validate, and empathize.
Like,
So, I mean, I could sit here and go into all of those in depth, but these are really just like basic, right? Like what we learn when we first become therapists. Like if we are able to hit these things, generally the people that we're working with are going to feel heard, they're going to feel seen, they're going to feel like you're with them, right? So these are like really simple things I think couples in these situations can kind of hold on to. Because yeah, it's not necessarily about fixing the emotion or fixing the experience. It's just how can I communicate to my partner that what they're going through makes sense and I can understand where you're coming from. And it's so real, like why you would be experiencing this. And like, yeah, I'm here with you. You know, I think that can be just really powerful.
I love that. That's super helpful. I think, especially with folks who are in long distance relationships, but really anyone generally, period, in any relationship. So yeah, that's a great tool, great acronym. I think
Yeah.
that's what those are called.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, I like that a lot. Something else that my mind was coming back to that I hear a lot from clients, both clients and like people in my life as well, and sometimes me, is like, what does it sound like? Like, what is an example of how to initiate conversations around, like how frequently we talk, for example, like, um, because sometimes it's just hard to even put that into words in a way that's like helpful and constructive and doesn't sound like, you know, I need us to do this, like, which sometimes it can be that,
Mhm.
um, but even just like an example, like how to bring up that topic and like what that script sounds like if anything like that comes to mind.
Yeah. Just to be clear, you're saying like specifically around like, yeah, how often we're speaking or how often like we should be speaking or I want to be speaking more. Is that?
Yeah, just for example, yeah, that one,
Yeah.
because it's a bit
Yeah. I
push.
mean, I think it's hard. Um, but yeah, trying to kind of approach it in a gentle manner, right? Like trying to kind of choose a gentle way to like start up a potentially, yeah, challenging conversation, or potentially like a conversation that might have charge, depending on, yeah, whatever it is, but especially if it's related to something to do with the nature of the distance, right? And maybe how that is presenting challenges like in the relationship. Um, so I think I guess that's not necessarily a script, but I think that's like my suggestion would be to try to approach it in that way. But again, it's not always possible, and there are potentially going to be moments where we don't, right? Like choose the right words, and maybe it doesn't go over the way that we're intending. And again, this is in relationships in general, but I think something that can be hard when that happens with the distance is um, we may need to take a break, but when we take a break, it kind of feels like maybe it's more high stakes because our partner isn't in the next room, right? It's like if we hang up, like I'm here by myself, and that could be really challenging, you know? So, yeah, I think utilizing breaks though is important, especially if it does feel like, um, yeah, one or both people aren't being heard, or yeah, potentially there's like a misinterpretation of the message that was intended. I don't really know if I answered your question, but that's that's where my mind went.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely hearing you say it's like a soft, gentle startup in the conversation of like, hey, I want to bring this to you, but it's also I think it goes back to some of the other stuff we've been talking about is now a good time. And then when maybe it becomes too escalated or there's increased misunderstanding, especially if it's like you're not getting like the physical feedback or like visual maybe. But it's like those breaks are going to be essential, but it's also like I mean, this is something that I talked with couples all the time about of like what is y'all's typical kind of agreement that can be flexible, obviously, but it's like when you do take breaks to help with that anxiety of like, is this going to be the rest of the night? Are they going to ice me out for the next 2 days? Or is this going to be, or what feels like icing out, stonewalling? Or is this something where it's like, all right, hey, this is, let's call it, let's take a break. And it's just this general understanding of like, this is going to be maybe something we need to pick up on in the morning. But when we call that break, like whoever calls it may want to check in and say like, hey, I still need some time to like, take,
Yeah.
to soothe myself or whatever before we get into it. But I do feel like that does just raise the complexity of it all of like or maybe it just like really shines a light on like the most direct and clear communication that you can have, but
Mhm.
also just the follow through and consistency on that feels important too, where it's like this is just kind of how we function and if we know that, we take a break and we have we're not going to talk until tomorrow 12 hours later, then it like could help a little bit, but it seems just so
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah, which yeah, we don't have to get into this super in depth, but I do think what you're highlighting is also just the way in which our own stuff, if you will, our own histories, potentially like, yeah, our own attachment experiences, right? Like how that can kind of influence our position in some of, yeah, like these patterns that we can get into with our partners, especially when we're not physically in the same place,
Mhm.
which I do think the nature of the distance for some of us can be more challenging than others because of our own histories. And yeah, again, the idea of like taking a break and potentially not getting to speak to your partner again or revisit whatever it was that were in conflict about for like another day, that can be really hard. Which kind of goes back to, some of what we were talking about earlier with just like these nervous system care activities that you can, yeah, like engage in to kind of help with that. But it is just to be expected. Like there is going to be moments in time where that's not something that we can necessarily avoid.
Mhm.
Yeah. I do want to additionally highlight kind of what both of y'all have said about the breaks and like the importance and helpfulness of them. And I recognize when I work with clients, like they often don't realize that there is that added step of like, we need to figure out when we're going to come back together. Like when we say we need to take a break, that's not like a, forever until we feel like coming back necessarily. Like let's put a time limit on it as much as possible and recognizing that for long distance couples, that time might have to be like a couple days down the line to intentionally revisit that conversation when there are enough spoons and time.
Mhm.
And so that can be really challenging. And again, especially because there's no way of like co regulating again or like soothing each other in the relationship. But when you guys were saying that, that kind of reminded me of, I don't know if any of y'all have watched How I Met Your Mother. And but there's a couple in there, Lily and Marshall, and they have this pattern of like whenever they're in a fight, they'll yell like pause and then just kind of carry on as if they're not fighting, which can be constructive in some ways. And then they'll unpause kind of randomly, which is not what we're advising necessarily. But this could be like an instance in which that could be a thing of like, let's maybe pause and watch some like animal videos together on YouTube or something like that so that we can calm ourselves down. We're not focused on like conflict between each other, and this is something that soothes both of us that we can do at the same time. That could be another option potentially depending on the situation.
Yeah.
um but kind of leads me to my next question a little bit distantly, of what are like some we mentioned technology is a huge component in staying in touch. What are some like technology related tools or just tools generally that you use that you know of that can be really helpful in maintaining that connection and that relationship that much more?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great one. I think you had, Sapna, even just mentioned this earlier, like the necessity for creativity in this type of dynamic. And I think that's especially true when it comes to, yeah, like not doing the same thing all the time to be connected and to be enjoying each other's company. So kind of figuring out like, yeah, what are other ways that we can be with each other that doesn't require just us sitting on the phone and talking. So yeah, I definitely have some ideas. So I am happy to share those and maybe even just from like my own perspective of some things that like my partner and I've tried. Um, Movie nights, right? Or we're maybe watching the same movie, but then maybe we do have a phone or something propped up where we are kind of enjoying it together, but yeah, obviously not in the same physical space. Some other ones like there's like online escape rooms that you can do, which is kind of cool. There are, yeah, like these. I don't know, there was a point in time on TikTok at some point where I got all of this content of couples doing these like cold case like murder mystery packets, where it's like you're kind of basically assigned as being the investigator of trying to figure out this case. And so like both people could like have all that information and then you're doing that together, kind of solving the case together, which is kind of fun. Other ideas, yeah, there's like arts and crafts, gaming. Um, I really love all of these different kind of like table topic conversation card decks. So there's like millions out there now. So I think those are really great ways to kind of mix things up and do something a little different. Yeah, and then getting old school, like maybe you could write an actual like letter to your partner, like a love letter, or sending a gift without their knowledge, right? Like flowers, whatever. Like you could do so much. Really the sky's the limit with that. But yeah, centering of creativity to me feels really important though, with the idea of like how are we gonna kind of keep the intimacy and connection alive in ways that, yeah, just might require us to kind of think about that a little bit more and be intentional about that and planning that.
I feel like that, as you're saying that, I mean, there is so much more like access to different services with technology too. Like that is one takeaway maybe from COVID. That's not the worst case. With like, I can order you dinner from afar and it can be
Yeah.
delivered to you and things like that. I know this is not in the context of like romantic relationships, but my best friend that lives across the country, we do Marco Polo all the time.
Mm,
And that's one of those things that's nice because it works in our friendship, right? But I think even in, like when my partner travels, it's nice because it kind of goes back to the spoon thing for me, where it's like I don't really like answering the phone most of the time. And while I like talking with my friends or like talking with my partner, like if I'm in the zone, like and I'm about to get broken out of it, like it threatens kind of like the present in ways that can be really tricky. And so that Marco Polo is like so fun. Not that I'm not a sponsor or like a, what do you call it, an affiliate or whatever you
Yeah.
call, you know what I mean. But just like that is where it's like, how do we get creative with it though? Where like when you said it's not just about like calling or texting, it's like there's so all those activities you listed off. I'm like, those are great date ideas, you know?
mhm,
It's something like playful in ways
mhm.
too. Like you can still access that play even if you're not in the same room, which feels like an important focus.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I agree. And yeah, I think something that maybe we didn't necessarily talk about yet or highlight yet is the importance of having just something fun, exciting to look forward to. I think that is also really important when you are navigating potentially an indefinite amount of time where you're going to be apart and you don't necessarily know when you're going to be together again, right? So I do think having some of these like novel, yeah, dates and experiences that you're planning for when you're apart, can kind of keep that excitement going, and give you some motivation and some energy to move through the distance until there is an opportunity to be together. Um, so yeah, I wanted to highlight that part too.
Yeah, I appreciate you highlighting that. And like novelty is something that's important in romantic relationships generally too, just to kind of keep things mixing it up and like, create new uh neural pathways together can be a really great form of connection just generally, but especially in long distance relationships when it's really easy to kind of fall into a pattern or routine and feel like there's not as many options for us to engage in something new together unless we're
Yeah.
actually physically together, which can be really rare, or, we may have unknown times of when that'll be again, as you mentioned. So like that is really important. And so I really appreciate those like half of those, I mean, it's been a minute since I was in a long distance relationship, but half of those, if I knew that they existed or if they had existed, it was pre-COVID for me.
Mhm.
So, that would have been nice. And thanks for sharing those.
Yeah. It's-
Also wanted to clarify, Marco Polo is a video,
Oh,
is an
thank
app
you.
and is a video
Yeah.
messaging. So like
Yeah,
you make
not
videos and
we're
send
not
them to
swimming on
your friend.
speakerphone playing Marco Polo. Yeah, good call. Good call. No, you could also do that. It'd be
Exactly.
It's
tricky.
Yeah.
true.
That's the name of the specific app, which is really fun
Yeah, that is fun.
for connecting in another way too, and can be another resource for people in long distance relationships as well if like their timelines aren't matching up, but they want to see each other's faces.
Mhm.
Um, for sure. But we're talking about, this novelty and like creating new ways of connecting with each other when that's limited, but there is some benefit too of like establishing kind of rituals of sorts, right? To kind of create security and stability.
Mhm.
And so like I'm curious if there are any of those kinds of rituals that we haven't talked about yet, or we could expand on,
Yeah.
that can be really helpful to make sure that are established.
Yeah,
Um, and like ways that they kind of help with the intimacy and connection.
totally.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. I kind of think of like rituals, check-ins, right? These things being more of the like routine maintenance, right? That again, I think is important in any relationship, but especially one where we are dealing with this distance factor. Um, so yeah, I think with rituals in particular, it really can be a way to reinforce your commitment to one another. I think it's a great way to kind of create meaning and a sense of identity within your relationship, which can be translated over to like when we're actually in person, right? Some of the things that you establish when you're apart can translate in person. So ideas of rituals, right, might be yeah, how do we greet each other and how do we part? Like, what are the things that maybe we say, or is there something that we do that's kind of unique to us, that maybe is just between us, right? Like, that might be a ritual that we want to establish, or maybe it's, yeah, we sit down and we're going to have like coffee together while we're on the phone before we start our day, or, um, let's say you have things on your to-do list and I have things on mine, and maybe we just need like the presence of the other person. So kind of almost like body doubling in our spaces while we're doing different things, right? But still having some form of connection while we're like on video or on the phone or something like that. Um, Many other ways that we can create rituals, but those are some kind of big ones that I guess are on the top of my mind. Um, yeah, and then I guess the other piece that I wanted to say, which we kind of did talk about a little bit earlier, is just the importance of adopting like appreciation practices in the relationship. So really being able to express gratitude for the ways in which like we are showing up in the partnership and the things that are going well, like really making an effort to make sure that those are getting highlighted because of the fact that there is so much that can be challenging about being apart in this way. And I do think as humans, right, sometimes we do have just the tendency to think more on the negative and like what's hard and what doesn't feel good. And so I think the intentional practicing of appreciation can really like build resilience against that. Which is, I think, especially important where we, yeah, don't have that physical proximity to kind of like rely on.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you're describing everything, I keep going back to like intimacy and like how we kind of break it down in a lot of the sessions with my couples is like that there's different types of intimacy, right? And we definitely feels like we're talking about a lot of emotional intimacy, I think intellectual intimacy. Like there's so many ways you can still access that. And like physical intimacy and sexual intimacy, I imagine are like you got to get really creative in those areas. And even as you're describing, I mean, I'm jumping way back to just the verbalization of like, I wish I could give you a hug right now, or I wish we were like cuddling right now and really close, or insert whatever. I think that that does get to some of the physical intimacy stuff, but it's also probably a challenge to figure out like, there is a lot of space and time and just like that physical contact. I mean, I've definitely had friends who it's like just lacking that. And, that goes to nervous system regulation in some degrees. But I was also curious of like other tips or strategies when it comes to like physical and sexual intimacy.
Yeah, yeah, it's an important aspect, I think, for many couples. And again, like I guess it's almost like when you know you can't have it, right? Literally, because we're not present with each other, that can really exacerbate feelings around where that is at, like how much of this are we having or how much of this does feel possible. So yeah, something that I think, yeah, her name's Dr. Emily Nagoski. She's the author of the book Come As You Are. She talks a lot about context for sex. And I think it feels important, especially when we're discussing this distance piece, because, yeah, when we have stress and other things going on in our life that are impacting our ability to like be present, it's going to feel really hard to even get into a headspace where the idea of engaging with my partner in this way is possible, so really kind of working to identify like what are the specific contexts that I need to be present in my space and for my partner in their space in order for this to even be possible for us to achieve, in any capacity. Um, Another thing that I like to talk to couples about is this idea of, yeah, and especially in distance, like how can we kind of intentionally schedule moments where we are engaging in some sort of intimate activity that may not be sexual in nature, right? But that could help get us there, right? Or potentially has kind of led us, maybe when we were in person, right, to sexual intimacy, right? Because I think the idea of actually scheduling time where it's like, okay, today we're gonna have sex, like that can be more anxiety inducing, right? So it's like we're already dealing with some stress, some anxiety, uncertainty about how this is gonna go. I think just the idea of having scheduled intimacy can be like a bridge to exploring, right, sexual forms of intimacy. Um, yeah, again, there's like so much that we could talk about with that. But again, just with the distance, it's like some people aren't comfortable doing phone sex or being on camera or right. Like there's just aspects of the nature of how we are connecting that may not work for folks in this like sexual realm. So that is just something to consider as well. Again, of like who you're dealing with and like what are your partner's comfort levels with this. And again, how to negotiate that so both people feel like they are being represented in how you're deciding to approach this topic.
Yeah. Yeah, and that kind of takes me again back to the spoons to a degree of like not totally the same thing, but kind of, I mean, it's all related of, if there's different energy levels, different sex drive between partners, like, being able to acknowledge that with each other and, like you said, find ways to still support your partner as best you can within where they're at. Um, but there's lots of layers to challenging, and so you're right, we could talk about that for a while. But another thing that came to mind that like I navigated in my relationship too is like even just non-sexual physical intimacy as well. Kind of you mentioned that as well, but I remembered like trying to figure out ways to do that um so that it was felt. So, for example, we ended up exchanging, not revolutionary to and not exclusive to long distance relationships, but exchanging like sweatshirts or t-shirts, or gifting each other a blanket and like spraying your cologne or perfume on it,
Yeah,
having a stuffed animal that kind of like represents like, hug me when you miss me, like, that type of thing, can be helpful as well. And kind of, that lead up thing that you also mentioned that
yeah,
can help in feeling a little more inclined towards or that foreplay sometimes, if you will, too. It may or may not be involved in foreplay, but it definitely could be. And so, yeah, there's a lot there to explore. But maybe we'll
Yeah,
continue exploring it in another time too. But
sure.
yeah, I feel like there's still plenty more to discuss, but for the time being, I'm wondering, kind of as we're wrapping up, are there any other things that we didn't touch on or didn't expand on as much that you would want to kind of add on to or highlight before we kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it was something that we kind of alluded to a few times, but maybe didn't talk about very explicitly. As another kind of just like maintenance piece, I think having regular check-ins with each other can be helpful, in addition to like the rituals, right? And some of the appreciation practices that we discussed. Also like, yeah, having a shared note with like, hey, when are you working and when are you free? And again, when we're dealing with like time zone changes and things like that, it's really hard to just literally tie down like where's my partner in the world today, on a day-to-day basis, right? So I think having some sort of um, living document, living schedule calendar that you're updating regularly to kind of keep each other in the loop about what's going on can be helpful. And yeah, just the check-in piece too is good to kind of help yeah, assess like what's going well, what do we still want to improve upon, and what are areas that maybe we'd like to come back to that we didn't have time to, right, in the week or in that moment. So I did at least just want to highlight those and speak to them directly since I don't think I had done that yet.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. That was something that my mind always goes to like some semblance of structure to reduce just kind of the anxiety that can be felt with just like it's almost like our brain works with like those are kind of like the guardrails around like I feel safe when I know that like
Yeah.
maybe we have had like a really busy week, but I know that like our typical way of like launching our week is on Mondays when we have our coffee and we kind of run through what our week is, or I know that we have like that shared calendar, so it's just like something to kind of anchor you in those times of like what could feel like disconnecting.
Mhm.
So I think those are really good strategies, and I think it's like I don't know, I have a lot of couples that live in the same house and kind of struggle to follow through on some of those like checkpoints. But I think that it is kind of relationship specific too. But it feels like in long distance relationships, it's almost like on the start of the relationship, it's like, hey, like let's try to like set some of this stuff up as just like what we do, or it's like just the way like our like habits of how we
Mhm.
connect or something.
Yeah.
And maybe in some ways it's just like normalizing like we're gonna have to talk a little bit more than maybe what we've been used to in other relationships. Like this is going to be a different version, but also like everything that you're talking about, it makes me feel like there's an added layer of intentionality that goes into being in a long distance relationship, where there isn't as much of that kind of like time of, I'm always around this person, like that separation can really like help with, a lot of what we talked about around like the intimacy and the desire for the person. But I also could see how yeah, it's like just tricky to find like what's our individual our relationships rhythm going to look like where we're both, really um being as intentional as possible, because I think that's the part that a lot of people after time passes it's like can go out the window, and it's an essential
Yeah.
ingredient here.
Yeah, just maybe one more thing to add on to that, which I don't think yeah, we didn't speak on today, but again, like as an idea that's helpful for any couples, but especially, yeah, long distance is, yeah, like this vision for what do we want our relationship to look and feel like, and recognizing that there is a responsibility for each of us to really commit to that and show that we're committing to that through X, Y, and Z ways, and so maybe like, yeah, intentionality or curiosity, we want to center these things. So I think like having a sense of, yeah, what is our vision for being in this dynamic, and also how that can guide us when maybe there's an opportunity, right, where we won't be in this dynamic anymore, right? But just to kind of set the stage even for like, yeah, how are we going to operate, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think one other note on that to add to is I've definitely worked with people who struggle with the idea of a relationship going long term. And it may be a situation where, like, there's a job change, is the first thing that comes to mind. It's like, well, it's either this or that. And I think everything that you've shared today is like, no, you can still have a very like fulfilling and connected and intimate relationship, even if there is that distance. And just like you need to put work in, not just like you have to put work in relationships, period. But it's like different context with long distance relationships, but it's possible, I mean, I think all the things that you shared today are is like a helpful guide, if you will, you know.
Yeah,
So thank you.
yeah, of course.
Really. This is so fun. I appreciate you sharing as much as you did and candidly, and there's so many ideas and there's so many other directions that this can continue to go in, but this was such a great foundational, informational start to the conversation, that we can decide if we're gonna pick up again,
Yeah,
on camera or not,
totally.
sometime down the line. But thank you so much for sharing this. Truly, I remember thinking when I was in a long distance relationship. Granted, again, it was quite a few years ago, but um, there's not always that many, resources and people that you can talk to about it or who like, specialize in it and have, an inkling of what it's like. So thank you for sharing all of that.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to share and yeah, would definitely be down to continue if that makes sense down the line.
Sweet.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us today, Bree. It's always a pleasure. And for those, as we're signing off, how can people find you? What's the best way to be in touch?
Yeah, probably through my website, which is just brctherapy.com. I also have an Instagram that I'm not super active on, but that is at Therapy with Bree. That's my handle on Instagram. And then I am on a couple of directories as well. Psychology Today, Inclusive Therapist, so you can find me there as well.
Awesome.
Sweet.
Well, thank you
Thanks
so
so much,
much.
Bree. We
Yeah,
appreciate you always. We always love talking to you. Feel free to come back again whenever you want.
Okay,
always
sounds
open here.
good.